Hey everybody, it's Tim from Tadabase here, and this is Build It with Tim. On today's episode, I have a quick tip for you all, and it's a tooltip. A tooltip is something that we can use inside of our application to display additional context information when hovering over any sort of element in your Tadabase application. We're going to be integrating with a third-party tool called Tippy.js in order to apply these tooltips inside your app. So let's jump into our sample application for today and get started. Here is the application that we're working with here. We are simply displaying a form to add new companies with a couple of different fields, and a table component to display that company information. So I want to add some additional context to all of these elements on the page, specifically the table columns and the form inputs, in order to display additional information through the use of a tooltip. To do this, we're going to be using Tippy.js. You can Google this and find this quite easily. This is a third-party library that we can integrate with our Tadabase application to make tooltips pretty seamless and pretty painless. Now, all of this is possible inside of Tadabase because of two main features. Inside of our app settings, we have our custom header footer code section, which allows us to input any sort of custom code that we want to run in the app head or the app footer. Typically, the code that we can put here includes script tags that allows us to import external libraries. In this case, we are importing the Tippy library and the Popper library. You can find these script tags and URLs directly from Tippy.js under the Getting Started tab here. You'll scroll down to CDN and you can see I have copied these production lines of code here and I've inputted them into my custom header footer section. Once I've done that, we can navigate to the page builder for part two of how these tooltips are actually going to work. Inside of Tadabase, we can apply custom CSS classes to nearly any part of our page structure. From the rows that contain our columns and content, we can apply additional CSS classes. Our columns can do the same by applying additional CSS classes. Our components can have additional CSS classes. And specifically within those components, the columns or the form inputs can also have additional CSS classes or custom CSS classes. Being able to assign these CSS classes in multiple different locations gives us immense flexibility when working with external JavaScript libraries. So inside my table component, I'm going to add custom CSS classes for each column that is being displayed. So you can label these classes however you wish. I'm going to try to be as descriptive as possible with the actual field title, but we have to make sure that we follow the rules for applying CSS classes or naming CSS classes, which means that anything that has a space in between is going to count as two separate classes. So I can either do something like camel case, or I could simply just hyphenate it or put an underscore in between. It doesn't matter as long as there's no spaces in between. So we'll call that one turnover rate. This one will be profit margin. And we'll call this one CSAT for customer satisfaction. We now have those four custom CSS classes applied to the columns within our table component. I can do the same thing inside of my form component by clicking on each field input, and I can give them the same or different CSS classes. In this case, I'm going to give them the same CSS classes just for the sake of demonstration. Profit, oh my goodness, profit margin. And last but not least, CSAT. Okay, our form and our table component now have custom CSS classes applied to each one of the fields that are being displayed in each component. The next thing we have to do is we need to initialize Tippy, which is our tooltip library that we're using, and we're going to do that inside of the JavaScript tab. So I'll paste in the code here, and we'll talk about each part that we have visible here on screen. So let me just save this JavaScript page, and then we'll kind of break this apart. So the first thing that we need to do is we need to use our Tadabase JavaScript API. And what we are doing here is we are defining a component ID that we are listening for, and we are basically just waiting for that component to be visible on our page. What I mean by that is visible on our live application as soon as it loads. So the component here on the left, the form component, is component number 3, and you can see that our tooltips are already functioning. We're going to use that JavaScript API to listen for this component being present on the page. To get our component ID, we can simply go back to the Page Builder Content tab and hover over the icon here in order to reveal the component ID. Going back to the JavaScript tab here, if we take a look at the rest of the code inside of our TB render function, we are initializing Tippy. We are telling Tippy what our custom CSS class is, or the CSS class that we want to target. And then we are simply just defining our content. So for each CSS class that we applied inside of our components, we can simply just describe our content that we want to display inside the tooltip. Now, this is going to work for both the form component and the table component. I'll make sure that I put in each component here as a separate TB render function so that we are listening for each component separately. But you can see when I go back to my live application, we can now have tooltips that show up over each form input and for each field and field value inside of our table component. And that's really the basis of how we can start implementing this third-party tooltip library into a Tadabase application. Now, obviously, what we just did was a very basic implementation of this library. Tippy has a lot more features that we can implement, so I suggest you check out Tippy specifically for all of the different features, styles, modifications that we can make for our tooltips. There's also stuff that we can do inside of Tadabase itself to make this a little bit more dynamic and a little bit more practical and user-friendly. So the code I'm going to paste in now is going to take this, bump this up to the next level a little bit. What we are going to do is we are going to pass the field values for each part of the table component for each record into our tooltip. Now, I'll admit I didn't come up with this code. I used ChatGPT to help me build this JavaScript code because I'm not capable of actually writing this code myself. You can see after we save our page and refresh our live application, now when we hover over each company name, it's actually going to output the field value. So this gives you a lot more power in how you are outputting content or additional context information into your tooltip. And the same can be said for the other 3 columns on this table. We are outputting the actual field values. So some pretty cool stuff that we can do with Tippy and third-party JavaScript libraries and the Tadabase JavaScript API. And I think more importantly, what this kind of shows is that Tadabase is much, much more than a simple no-code application builder. In fact, Tadabase really thrives as a low-code application builder, functioning more as a really powerful development tool rather than just a simple application builder. All right, so that's it for this week's episode of Build It with Tim. We'll see you next time. Take care.